The first time Virginia Bishop laid eyes on Cornelius Barnett, every woman on the porch of Caldwell's General Store took a collective step backward, and Virginia stepped forward. It was the autumn of 1878, in the sun-baked town of Redemption Creek, Texas, a place that had grown up fast along the edge of the Llano Estacado, where the caprock crumbled into cedar breaks and red dirt arroyos. Redemption Creek was the kind of town that had ambitions above its station. A telegraph office that worked 2 days out of 3, a proper hotel with a dining room, 3 saloons, a church that was newer than the saloons, and a weekly newspaper that mostly reported on cattle prices and the occasional scandal. The cattle drives had slowed since the Kisham Trail's best years, but ranching had taken firm root in the surrounding land, and ranchers like Cornelius Barnett had built themselves something solid and lasting out of the limestone hills. Virginia Bishop had arrived on the Wednesday stage from San Antonio, carrying 1 large trunk, 1 small leather satchel, and a letter of introduction from a physician in Bexar County recommending her as a skilled nurse and apothecary's assistant. She was 26 years old, with dark auburn hair she kept in a practical braid, steady brown eyes that missed very little, and hands that were strong and sure from years of mixing medicines and dressing wounds. She had grown up watching her father, a country doctor, treat every manner of injury and illness without flinching, and she had inherited his particular quality of calm in the face of things that made other people look away. The women on Caldwell's porch were Mrs. Patton, Mrs. Aldrich, and young Clara Finch, who was barely 19 and had been in Redemption Creek for only 3 months herself. They had been discussing fabric prices and the upcoming harvest social when the big bay horse came down the main street at a deliberate, unhurried walk. The rider sat straight in the saddle with the particular ease of a man who had spent more of his life on horseback than off it. He wore a dark coat, dust pale at the shoulders, and a hat pulled low against the afternoon sun. When he turned to check a wagon pulling out of the livery, the light caught the left side of his face, and all 3 women on the porch went quiet. The scarring ran from just below his left eye down across his jaw and partway down his neck, thick and roped and unmistakably the work of fire. It was old scarring, well healed, but startling in the unguarded moment of encountering it. Mrs. Patton made a small sound. Clara Finch pressed close to the porch post as if it might provide cover. Mrs. Aldrich turned her face toward the door of the store. Virginia watched the rider pass with the frank, assessing look of a woman who had cataloged 100 different wounds and understood what she was seeing. She saw the old contracture of the skin along the jaw, the slight limitation it put on his expression on that side, and she thought, without drama, that someone had known what they were doing when they treated it. The healing was good, old and clean. She also noticed that his hands on the reins were steady, that the horse moved without nervousness, and that the man himself did not look toward the porch, which suggested he was well past expecting anything pleasant from the looking. "Lord above," Mrs. Patton murmured, once he had ridden far enough down the street. "That is Cornelius Barnett," Mrs. Aldrich said quietly, turning back from the door now that the subject had moved on. "He runs the Barnett Ranch out past Cutler's Creek, about 4,000 acres. Is he married?" Virginia asked because it was a practical question that had nothing particularly romantic in it. She was simply cataloging the town's inhabitants as she arrived. All 3 women looked at her with an expression that suggested the question itself was mildly eccentric. "No," said Clara Finch. "No one will, I mean. He keeps to himself." Virginia nodded, filled the information away alongside everything else she was learning about Redemption Creek, and helped Mrs. Aldrich carry her bolt of calico inside. She did not think about Cornelius Barnett again until Thursday morning, when she was setting up the back room of Doc Harlan Pruitt's office, and Harlan himself came in shaking rain off his hat and told her that her first real test was going to arrive inside the hour. Harlan Pruitt was 61, had been the only doctor in Redemption Creek for nearly a decade, and his right hand had developed a tremor over the past year that made delicate work difficult. That was why he had written to San Antonio for help, and why Virginia was here. He was a direct man who had spent too long being the only medical resource for a 100-mile radius to waste time on formality. "Barnett's foreman rode in this morning," Harlan said, setting his bag on the table. "One of the ranch hands got his leg caught between two spooked horses yesterday afternoon. Possible fracture, definitely some tissue damage. Barnett's bringing him in himself." "How far is the ranch?" "About 9 miles. They'll be here by 10 if the rain doesn't soften the road too badly." Harlan paused and looked at her with the calibrated assessment of a man who had trusted his practice to a stranger. "You said in your letter that you'd assisted with fractures." "Several, and I've set one on my own when the doctor was occupied with a more critical patient." She met his eyes calmly. "I'll need to examine it before I can tell you more." "Good enough," he said, and put the kettle on. Cornelius Barnett arrived at 10:30, driving a wagon with a canvas stretched over the back to keep the rain off his injured ranch hand. He brought the wagon to a precise stop in front of Pruitt's office, set the brake, and climbed down in a single fluid motion that put him standing in the rain without his coat because he had given it to the man in the back. Virginia was already opening the door when he came up the steps because she had heard the wagon. Up close, the scarring was more complex than it had appeared from across a street. The fire had taken him on the left side from cheekbone to collarbone, and the healed tissue pulled very slightly at the corner of his eye and the edge of his mouth, giving his expression an asymmetry that was particularly noticeable when he was neutral. He was 32 years old, tall, with dark eyes that were examining the doorway and the room beyond it with quick professional thoroughness before he had even finished stepping inside, the way a careful man examines new environments by habit. He was, Virginia thought, quite good-looking on the right side of his face, and something about the totality of him, the steadiness, the efficiency, the wet shirt that he didn't seem to notice, suggested a man who had organized his life around doing what needed to be done and asking very little in return. He looked at her with something between surprise and reserve. "Doc Pruitt," he said. "I am Miss Virginia Bishop," she said, already moving past him toward the wagon. "I am assisting Dr. Pruitt. Let us get your man inside." He turned without comment and helped her get the injured ranch hand, a young man named Eddie Garza, who was 20 and trying very hard not to show how much pain he was in, onto the examination table. Harlan took the history while Virginia examined the leg with careful, methodical hands, finding the point of maximal tenderness along the fibula, testing range of motion at the ankle, watching Eddie's face for the information that a patient's expression always gives more honestly than their words. "It is a fracture," she said to Harlan. "Clean, I think. Lower fibula. No significant displacement that I can feel, but we should splint it properly." "Agreed," Harlan said. She became aware, while she was working, that Cornelius Barnett was standing against the far wall with his arms folded, and his dark eyes tracking everything she did with an attention that was neither impolite nor uncomfortable, but simply thorough. When she glanced up once, she found him watching her hands, not her face, and there was nothing speculative in his expression. He was watching the way a man watches someone do skilled work when he is responsible for the outcome. "He will need to stay off it," she said when they were done. 6 weeks minimum. He should not ride for 8. Cornelius Barnett looked at Eddie Garza, who looked mortified. "I have got a cook and a bunkhouse full of men who are very bad at mending tack," Cornelius said to Eddie, with a dryness that made Eddie laugh despite himself and then wince. "You have been wanting an excuse to fix the harness situation. Now you have one." He paid Harlan Pruitt without making it a point, said thank you with the quiet sincerity of a man who did not say things he did not mean, and then paused on his way out the door because Virginia was washing her hands at the basin and he was a man who finished the business he started. "You are new here," he said. It was not a question, but it was not quite a statement either. "I arrived yesterday," she said. A pause. "You did good work." She turned from the basin and dried her hands and looked at him the same way she had looked at him from the porch, directly, without the sideways quality that people often used when they wanted to look at the scarring without appearing to look at it. She had the strong impression that he noticed the difference, because something very small shifted in his expression, some slight release of a tension that he probably didn't know he was carrying. "Thank you," she said simply. "Your man will heal well if he rests properly." "I will make sure of it," he said, and he put his hat on and went out into the rain. Harlan Prout made a small sound from behind her that might have been surprise. Virginia looked at him. "What?" she said. "In the 6 years he has been coming to this office," Harlan said, "that is the longest conversation I have ever heard him hold with anyone he did not already know." Virginia turned back to the basin to rinse it out, and she thought that was probably telling, but she did not yet know what it was telling her. Redemption Creek had approximately 450 residents, and the majority of them had formed an opinion about Cornelius Barnett that had calcified somewhere between pity and wariness. The story of the scarring was known in the way that all stories about private men become known in small towns, imperfectly, through second-hand tellings that had accumulated small embellishments over years. The fire had happened when he was 23, at the previous Barnett homestead some miles to the east, during a spring night when the wind had been wrong and a lamp had gone over. He had gotten his younger sister out of the house before the roof came down, and the roof had come down while he was still inside. His sister, a woman named Clara Barnett who had since married and moved to Kansas, was alive because of him. What the town knew was the fire and the scars, and the fact that he had, in the 9 years since, built the Barnett Ranch into one of the finest operations in that part of Texas, without asking anyone for help and without, seemingly, needing anyone at all. He came to town for supplies, for business at the bank, occasionally for church, and he had turned down every dinner invitation and social overture that had been extended to him in the years since the fire, so consistently and so politely that people had eventually stopped extending them. There was a general agreement that Cornelius Barnett was a decent man who had had something terrible happen to him, and had responded by deciding that walls were safer than windows. What the town did not know, because he had not told anyone and was not in the habit of telling anyone things, was that the walls had been built mostly because of the way people looked at him, or more precisely the way they looked away, and that he had found over 9 years that the anticipation of that moment, the sideways flinch, the averted eye, the overcorrected cheerfulness that was somehow worse, had become more exhausting than the isolation. It was simply easier to stay on the ranch where there were cattle and horses and land and work, and none of that particular human quality of discomfort that he seemed to produce in people without intending to. He had not expected a woman to look at him the way Virginia Bishop had. Directly, without performance, the way she had looked at his ranch hand's leg, with attention that was interested in what was actually there rather than in managing its own reaction to it. He rode home in the rain thinking about it with a puzzlement that was not unpleasant, the way you might think about a thing you had not encountered before and were not entirely sure what category it belonged in. He came back to town a week later for supplies, which was slightly more often than he usually came to town. He told himself it was because he needed to check on Eddie Garza's progress, which was true and also not the whole truth. Virginia was sweeping the steps of Prout's office when he rode past, and she looked up and said, "Good morning, Mr. Barnett," in the tone of a woman greeting a passing acquaintance, straightforward and pleasant, without the particular brightness people sometimes affected around him that he recognized as compensation. He pulled up his horse. "Miss Bishop, morning." "Your man is doing well," she said. "He came in 2 days ago for a check. The fracture is holding cleanly. He tells me you gave him a very thorough lecture about staying off it. He was considering riding out to check the north pasture fence line," she said. "So yes, I was thorough." Something moved in his expression that was very nearly a smile. "Thank you for that. He is 20 years old and constitutionally opposed to sitting still." Most 20-year-olds are, she said. She had rested the broom against the railing and was looking at him with the calm attention that he had been, he realized, thinking about on and off for a week. How long have you ranched in this country? It was a simple question, an ordinary question. People asked it of each other constantly, and yet Cornelius Barnett could not have said the last time anyone who was not a business contact or an old family acquaintance had asked him a simple, ordinary question and waited for the answer with what appeared to be genuine interest. 9 years, he said. You like it, she said, not as a question. I do. You can tell, she said, when someone speaks about their land, there is a quality to it. He looked at her for a moment. You have family in ranching. My father was a doctor in a ranching community, she said. I spent a lot of time listening to people talk about their land. After a while, you learn what it sounds like when a place belongs to someone. She picked up her broom. I am glad your man is healing well, Mr. Barnett. Good morning. He rode on, and he spent the better part of that morning aware of a feeling that he could not immediately name, which turned out on reflection to be the simple, warm human sensation of having had a real conversation with someone, and being surprised to find that he had missed it. The harvest social was held in mid-October in the cleared space behind the church, with lanterns strung between the oak trees and tables of food contributed by the farming and ranching families of the area, and a fiddle player from out at the Lindstrom place who was genuinely excellent. The whole town came, or very nearly, because harvest socials were one of those events in a community like Redemption Creek that were less about celebration than about the ritual affirmation that everyone was still here, still managing, still part of something. Virginia went because Harlan Pruitt told her it would introduce her to the families she would be treating over the coming months, which was practical and true. She wore her best dress, a dark green wool that she had since San Antonio, and she put her hair up with the tortoiseshell pins that had been her mother's, and she was occupied for the first 2 hours of the social being introduced to approximately half of the county's population, learning names and faces, and the medical histories that people volunteer when they discover you are a nurse, which is an intimate kind of social interaction all its own. She did not particularly expect Cornelius Barnett to be there. From everything she had gathered in 3 weeks in Redemption Creek, he did not attend social events. He arrived at 7:30, while the fiddle player was working through a particularly energetic reel, and Virginia noticed him primarily because the social space contracted slightly around him in the way that spaces do when someone enters whom the collective group is not entirely comfortable with. He moved through it with the practiced ease of a man who knew exactly how much space to give people, and had long since stopped taking it personally. He went directly to the table where the ranching men gathered, shook hands with 2 or 3 of them, accepted a cup of cider from the table, and positioned himself at the slightly quieter edge of the group with the settled patience of a man who has come out of a sense of duty and intends to fulfill it adequately. Virginia watched him for a moment from across the cleared space, and then she went back to learning names. The evening progressed. The fiddle player started a slower tune. The lantern swung gently in a light wind that had come up from the south, warm for October, smelling of the cedar brakes and the distant grass. Virginia had finished her tour of introductions and was standing with Clara Finch, who had relaxed considerably since their first meeting, and turned out to be a bright, observant young woman who taught school and had a very dry sense of humor about her students. He came, Clara said, with a slight tilt of her head toward the ranching men's corner. I noticed, Virginia said. He never comes, Clara said. In the 3 months I have been here, I have been told on 4 separate occasions by 4 separate people that Cornelius Barnett does not attend social events, and yet here he is. A pause. People are talking about why. People always find something to talk about, Virginia said. Clara gave her a sharp, amused look. Most of them seem to think it has something to do with the new nurse. Virginia felt a small, private warmth that she did not show in her expression. That seems like a great deal to read into a man attending a community social. Perhaps, Clara said. But you should know that Mrs. Patton has already told at least 3 people that she thinks it is very forward of you to speak to him on the street the way you do. I speak to him the same way I speak to everyone, Virginia said. I know that, Clara said, and I think that is probably precisely the issue. Virginia looked across the cleared space to where Cornelius Barnett was standing, and found that he was already looking at her, and that when their eyes met, he did not look away in the quick, automatic fashion of a man who has been caught at something. He simply continued to look at her with that steady, direct quality that she recognized as the mirror of her own, and after a moment he inclined his head slightly, and she returned the gesture, and something warm and uncomplicated passed between them across 20 yards of lantern-lit autumn air. "Go talk to him," Clara said pleasantly. "I am not going to go talk to him in front of the entire town," Virginia said. "That would be conspicuous." "You are already conspicuous," Clara said. "You might as well be conspicuous and happy about it." Virginia laughed, which was a sound she did not always make in public but which came naturally here, and she stayed where she was for a while longer, and it was Cornelius himself who, after 20 minutes during which the angle of the lantern light shifted and the fiddle player started a waltz, made his way across the cleared space to where she was standing. He had a second cup of cider, which he held out to her without preamble because she had apparently been without a drink for some time and he had noticed. She accepted it. "You came to the social," she said. "I come occasionally," he said, which was technically true if interpreted generously. "How is the north pasture fence line?" she asked, something close to a real smile this time. "Eddie did not go. I sent 2 other men." "Wise," she said. They stood together at the edge of the dancing, which was filling up as the waltz took hold, and they talked about ranching, about medicine, about San Antonio and the years she had spent there, about the particular quality of the light in this part of Texas that was different from anywhere else she had been, a light that made everything look like it was about to be remembered. He talked about the land with that quality she had noticed before, the quality of belonging, and she listened with genuine attention, and he talked more than he had talked in a single evening in years, and somewhere in the middle of it, he became aware that his shoulders were not in the position he usually held them in public, the position of slight preemptive withdrawal, but had dropped to something more natural, something closer to how he stood on his own land. "You are not from Texas originally," she said. It was an observation, not a probe. "Kentucky," he said. "My family came west in '68. I was 22. She did the arithmetic without making it visible. She did not ask about the fire, because she was not a woman who asked about things before she was invited to, and because she understood that there is a kind of confidence that has to be built before certain things can be shared, and that it is built out of exactly what they were doing now: ordinary conversation, genuine attention, the small accumulation of trust that happens when someone consistently proves that they are not going to flinch or perform or treat you as a category rather than a person." "What brought you to Redemption Creek?" he asked her, and the question had a quality she recognized as reciprocal. He was asking because he wanted to know, not because courtesy required it. She told him honestly about her father's death 18 months ago, about the doctor's practice in San Antonio that she had been working in, about the letter from Harlan Pruitt, and the decision to come somewhere that needed skilled medical help and had a practical use for what she knew. She did not make it sound more noble than it was, and she did not make it sound harder than it was, and he listened with the same quality of genuine attention that she gave to things. "You miss him," Cornelia said about her father. "Every day," she said, "but I carry him in the work." A pause in which the fiddle played and the lantern swung, and the night was warm and full of the particular sweetness of October in South Texas. "That is a good way to carry someone," he said quietly, and she understood without being told that he was speaking from his own experience of carrying things. He walked her back to her boarding house at the end of the evening, because it was late, and the streets were not entirely peaceful, once the saloons had been at work for a few hours. They walked without closing the polite distance that was proper, and they talked a little about nothing in particular. And at her door he took off his hat and said good night with a formality that was not stiff but was respectful. And she said good night back, and he walked away down the dark street. And Virginia Bishop stood on her boarding house porch for a moment in the warm October air and felt something she had not felt in a long time. Something she did not have an immediate word for but which was present and unmistakable. Inside, her landlady, Mrs. Flora Hennessy, was in the parlor with her knitting and a look of profound satisfaction. "That was Cornelius Barnett, Mrs. Hennessy said. "It was," Virginia confirmed and went to bed. October gave way to November with a cold front that blew down from the panhandle and turned the cedar brakes a dusty gray and brought the first frost to the lower ground. Virginia settled into the routine of Prout's practice, which was full and busy and demanded every skill she had. She treated influenza and infected wounds and a complicated birth that she and Harlan managed together through a long, difficult night. And a cowboy from the trail who had been thrown from his horse and dislocated his shoulder, and an older farmer who had let a cut go too long without treatment, and had a serious infection that took 2 weeks of careful work to turn back. She was good at the work and she was tireless, and after a month Harlan Prout told her that she was the most competent medical assistant he had ever had, which was not the most effusive compliment in the world, but from Harlan it was considerable. Cornelius Barnett came to town twice in October and 3 times in November, which was noticeably more often than his previous pattern, a fact that was widely observed and discussed in Redemption Creek with the lively, sometimes unkind interest that small towns develop in the private lives of their inhabitants. Virginia was aware of the discussion and found it less troubling than amusing. She could not entirely control what people said, and she was not going to manage her behavior to accommodate other people's discomfort. And so she continued to greet Cornelius when she saw him, and to talk with him when the opportunity arose with the same natural ease that she would have applied to anyone. What she was less willing to admit, even to herself, was how much she looked forward to those occasions. How she had begun to notice, in the general business of the street, the particular posture of a man on a bay horse. How the conversations they had were different from other conversations in a quality she tried to analyze and could only describe as the feeling of being fully in the room with someone. None of the portion of your attention that you always reserve for managing the interaction was needed, and so all of it was available for actually being present, and it turned out that was quite remarkable. He came to the office one Tuesday in late November with a cut on his right forearm that he had gotten from a piece of barbed wire, which was bad enough to need proper cleaning and binding, but which he had clearly not planned to come to the office about until someone on his ranch, possibly Eddie Garza, fully healed and back at work, and apparently feeling that he owed Miss Bishop a debt, had insisted on it. Harlan was out at a farm delivery, and Virginia cleaned and dressed the cut with the focused efficiency she applied to all her work, and Cornelius sat on the examination table with his sleeve rolled up and submitted to the treatment with the patient cooperation of a man who is perhaps slightly more tolerant of the situation than the situation strictly requires. "This is not a new thing for you," he said, watching her work. "Cleaning wounds. No. I have been doing this since I was about 12 alongside my father. It does not bother you." It was not quite a question. She glanced up at him briefly. "What specifically?" A pause. "Any of it, the things you see in this work." She understood the question had a larger scope than just the immediate wound. She finished tying off the bandage and considered her answer with the care she gave to things that deserved it. "The suffering bothers me," she said. "That would bother me even if I had done this work for 100 years, and I would not want it to stop, because the day it stops bothering you is the day you become less useful." She set down the bandage. "But the looking at things, the being present with things that are difficult, no. My father taught me early that the only way to help is to actually see what is there. You cannot treat what you cannot look at. Cornelius was quiet for a moment, and she could feel him thinking about the weight behind that statement in a context that was larger than a cut forearm, and she let it sit there between them without pushing it. "He sounds like he was a very good man," Cornelius said. "He was," she said. "He was also stubborn, occasionally difficult, and deeply certain that he was right about everything. But he was a very good man." Cornelius laughed, and it was a real laugh, unguarded, and it changed his face entirely, both sides of it, the unmarked side and the scarred side together, and the effect was startlingly warm. She saw him register that he had laughed in front of her, perhaps more openly than he usually allowed himself, and she watched him wait to see what she would do with it. She did nothing with it. She just smiled back naturally and turned to put away her supplies. He rolled his sleeve down. "How is the north fence line?" she asked. "Fully repaired," he said. "Eddie supervised." "Good," she said. "Come back in 4 days so I can look at that." He came back in 4 days. He also came back the week after that, which was not medically necessary, and they both knew it. And Virginia made coffee on the small stove in the back room, and they sat in the 2 chairs that flanked it while the December wind rattled the office windows. And they talked for an hour and a half about a range of things that had nothing to do with medicine or ranching, and everything to do with the particular pleasure of being in the company of someone whose mind you find genuinely interesting. He told her about Kentucky, about his family's land there before the war, and the way the war had unmade things, and the decision to go west, and the years of building something in a place where what you built was what you had, with no history and no expectation to inherit, only the land and the work and the life you made from them. He did not tell her about the fire that night, but he told her about his sister, Clara, and the way they wrote letters twice a year, and how her children called him Uncle Cornelius in their best handwriting in the margins. He said it with a warmth that was uncomplicated and genuine. She told him about her mother, who had died when Virginia was 15, and about the years of being her father's primary helper, and how she had not entirely understood until much later the degree to which that had shaped who she was, not in a bitter way, but in a true one. She told him about a man she had been nearly engaged to in San Antonio, a lawyer named Raymond, who had been perfectly kind and perfectly sensible, and had wanted her to stop nursing once they were married, and how she had understood in the moment that he said it that the answer was no, and that the answer would always be no. Cornelius listened to that with the kind of full attention that she was beginning to recognize as one of his defining qualities. "You were right," he said. "I know that now," she said. "At the time I was quite sad about it for a while. Being right about something important is often sad," he said. She looked at him across the small stove in the gray December light. "Yes," she said, "it is." There was a quality to the silence that followed that was different from ordinary silence. She was aware of it, and she was aware that he was aware of it, and she was aware of the decision they were both making in that moment, which was the decision about whether to acknowledge what was happening between them or to let it remain in the comfortable, unstated territory where it had been living. She thought she knew which way she would go on that decision. She was less sure what he would do with it. He stood up after a moment and put on his hat. "I should get back," he said. "Of course," she said. He paused at the door with his hand on the frame, which she had begun to recognize as a characteristic moment for him. The pause at the threshold, the brief hesitation between going and staying. "Virginia," he said, and the use of her given name was itself a small step across a threshold, because he had been calling her Miss Bishop for 2 months, and she had been calling him Mr. Barnett, and it was December now, and they both knew each other considerably better than that. "Yes," she said. "Would you?" He stopped, started again. "There is a stretch of the ranch along the South Creek that I have been meaning to show someone for approximately 9 years. It is the best piece of land I own. I have never quite found the right occasion to share it with anyone." Another pause, and she could see him navigating something internal with the focused effort of a man who is doing something genuinely difficult. "I think I would like to show it to you, if you would come." It was perhaps the most carefully constructed invitation she had ever received, and also the most honest one. "I would come," she said. He nodded once with the precision of a man who is keeping himself contained, because the alternative would be to show how much he had wanted that answer. "Saturday," he said. "I will bring a horse for you." He walked out into the December cold, and Virginia Bishop sat back down in her chair and pressed both hands flat on her thighs and felt something large and warm and slightly frightening opening up in her chest. The way country opens up when you come over a ridge and find a valley you did not know was there. Saturday came with high clear skies and cold, still air that made the cedar breaks look sharp and vivid against the blue. Cornelius arrived at her boarding house at 9 in the morning with his bay and a gentle gray mare, and Mrs. Hennessy watched them ride out from the parlor window with the expression of a woman filing a report she intends to share widely. The 9 miles to the Barnett Ranch went easily in the cold, clear air, with conversation that moved between comfortable and companionable, and Virginia had ridden enough of her life in rough country that she sat the gray mare naturally and well, and she felt Cornelius notice that and relax slightly, the way a person relaxes when they discover they do not have to adapt their pace for someone. The ranch itself was more than she had expected, which was to say it was serious and well built, and had the particular quality of a place where someone had thought carefully about every decision. The main house was limestone and timber, 1 story but generous, with a wide porch that faced south toward the hills, a kitchen garden that had been put to bed for winter, a barn that was as solid as the house, a well-maintained set of corrals, a bunkhouse for the hands. There were 6 permanent ranch hands, all of whom Virginia had encountered at various points in the practice, and who regarded her arrival on the ranch with varying degrees of studied unconcern that did not fool anyone. Cornelius gave her a brief tour of the buildings, speaking about them with the plain pride of a man who had built something real, and she asked specific questions about the limestone cutting and the water situation and the management of the pastures, and he answered them with the particular pleasure of someone who is rarely asked to explain their work to someone genuinely interested. Then he saddled 2 fresh horses and took her south. The South Creek was a 1/4 mile of clear water in a shallow limestone canyon, lined with massive live oaks that were the oldest living things Virginia had seen since she came to Texas, and the water ran over white rock shelves in small clear falls that caught the winter sunlight and scattered it. The canyon walls were warm sandstone, and along their faces were bands of color where different rock layers had been exposed, red and ochre and cream. In summer, this place would be lush and green with ferns along the water. In winter, it was spare and brilliant and absolutely still. Cornelius dismounted and stood beside the creek with his hat in his hand, and the winter light fell on both sides of his face equally, and he looked at the water with an expression that was so unguarded and private that Virginia felt for a moment that she was seeing something he had not intended to show anyone. 9 years, she said softly. 9 years, he confirmed. I built the house first, then the barn, then the corrals, and then I found this. And I thought, if this is what is on this land, then I am going to make something worth this. He looked at the water. I do not know if I have managed that, but I have tried. You have, she said, and said it simply, because it was true and he needed to hear it said straight. He looked at her then, fully, with the kind of look that was done with navigation, and decided to simply be. The light was cold and direct, and the scarring on the left side of his face was as visible as it ever was in any light, and she held his gaze with the same steadiness she had been offering him since the day on the porch, and he looked back at her with something she could only call wonder, not the overwhelming kind, but the quiet kind, the kind that comes from encountering something you had believed did not exist and finding out you were wrong. Virginia, he said. Cornelius, she said, I am going to say something that I am not practiced at this. I want you to know that because whatever I say it is going to be, tell me, she said. I am not going to run. He breathed in once. I know that, he said. I think that is the thing I am still getting used to, that you are not going to run. A moment passed between them that was full and still and entirely real. I have been alone for 9 years, he said, by my own choosing. Because it seemed simpler, safer. I had decided that I was suited for this kind of life, the solitary kind, that I preferred it, and I had believed that for long enough that I had stopped questioning it. He looked at the water. And then you stepped forward on that porch when every other woman stepped back, and you looked at me the way you look at everything, as if you are actually interested in what is there, and in the 3 months since then I have not been able to stop thinking about it. About you. About what it would be too. He stopped. Gathered himself. I am saying this badly. You are saying it perfectly, Virginia said, and her voice was steady, but the steadiness was requiring something of her now, because she was moved in a way she had not been in years, in a way that Raymond the lawyer in San Antonio had never come close to moving her, in a way that had the quality of something deep and real and serious. He turned from the water to look at her, and she was close enough now that she could see the particulars of him clearly, the strong line of his jaw on the unmarked side, the complexity of the healed tissue on the other, the darkness of his eyes that were watching her with a care and an uncertainty and an unmistakable hope that were the most honest things she had ever seen in a person's face. I am not asking for anything, he said. I want to be clear about that. I am not. You have only been here 3 months, and I understand that, and I am not trying to press you toward anything you are not ready for. I just a pause. I wanted you to know what is true. Because you have been showing me that truth is what you deal in, and I would rather deal in the same currency with you. She stepped toward him over the cold limestone shelf, carefully, and she took his right hand in both of hers, and she looked up at him with the full, steady directness that she gave to everything that mattered. Cornelius, she said, I stepped forward on that porch because I could see that you were a person who deserved to be seen clearly. And everything since then has told me that I was exactly right. You are one of the most honest and careful and genuinely decent men I have met in my life, and I have been in this valley for approximately 3 minutes, and I believe it is the most beautiful place I have ever stood. She paused. I am telling you that I would like to come back here, often, and I am telling you that it is not the valley I mean. He looked at their joined hands for a moment and then up at her face, and the expression that moved through his features was so full and so unguarded that she felt the privilege of it, the privilege of being trusted with someone's whole face, the unreserved face of a man who had kept it carefully behind reserve for 9 years. Virginia, he said, with a quality in it like a door coming open. Yes, she said, knowing he had not asked a question and knowing that it was the right answer anyway. He covered her hands with his free hand and held them there against the cold air with a warmth that was steady and real, and they stood together beside the South Creek in the winter sunlight, while the water ran clear over the white rock shelves, and Virginia Bishop felt the valley opening up in her chest become something warmer and larger and much less frightening than it had been. They rode back to the ranch house for the noon meal, which was prepared by the ranch cook, a broad and efficient man named Augusto who had been with the Barnett Ranch for 6 years, and who served the food with the studiously neutral expression of a man who was extremely pleased about something, and had decided to show it through the quality of the biscuits. December deepened, and the routine between them developed a natural richness. He came to town twice a week, and half those visits included an hour in the back room of Pruett's office, with coffee and conversation that ranged widely. She came out to the ranch on Saturdays when her duties allowed, and they rode the land together in the winter cold, and she learned the particular vocabulary of the place, which pastures held water in drought years, which draws offered shelter from the northers, where the deer came down to drink at the South Creek in the early morning. She was a quick and attentive student of everything, and he was, she discovered, one of those people who become more themselves the more they feel safe to be, expanding gradually into the space that trust opens up, so that the man she knew in January was measurably more whole and present than the man she had met in October. There were harder things in it too, because real intimacy is not without difficulty. He told her about the fire in January, on a cold night when they were sitting on the porch of the ranch house, wrapped in blankets with cups of coffee, because he had reached the point where not telling her felt like keeping something from her that she deserved to know. He told it plainly, without drama, the bare facts of it: the lamp, the wind, his sister's room, the roof. And she listened the way she listened to everything, with full attention, and when he was done she said nothing for a moment, and then she put her hand on his arm and said, "You carried her out." "Yes," he said. "I thought so," she said. "The moment someone told me about the fire, I thought that must be what happened, because you are exactly the kind of man who would go back." He looked at her steadily. "It left me looking the way I look." "I know," she said, "and I want to say something about that if you will let me." "Go ahead," he said. "I have looked at your face every day for 3 months," she said. "I looked at it the first day you rode past the general store porch, and I have looked at it every day since. And what I see when I look at it is you. Not the fire, not the scars, you. The way you think is on your face. The way you feel things is on your face. And all of it, every part of it, is completely specific to you, and I could not imagine you looking any different." She paused. "That is not a kind thing I am saying to make you feel better. It is an honest thing. And you know the difference by now, I think." He did know the difference. That was perhaps the most disorienting part of loving Virginia Bishop, the persistent verification that she meant what she said, that the directness was structural and not performance, that the steadiness was not a temporary mercy that would eventually run out. "I know the difference," he said. She leaned into his side in the cold January air, and he put his arm around her shoulders, and they sat on the porch of the ranch he had built out of 9 years of solitary work, and watched the stars over the dark hills. And it was the simplest and most complete thing either of them had felt in a long time. February brought a trial, as February in that part of Texas often did, which came in the form of a man named Walter Greer. Walter Greer was a land speculator out of Dallas who had been moving through the region since November, interested in acquiring parcels for consolidation and resale to a northeastern investment concern. He was pleasant-looking, well-dressed in a way that was slightly too fine for the country, and he operated in the particular mode of men who are very good at appearing to offer something while actually taking it. He had already purchased 2 smaller farms from families who had been struggling since the drought years of 75 and 76, and the purchases had been technically fair, but conducted with a pressure that most people in Redemption Creek had noticed without quite being able to articulate. In February, he set his attention on the Barnett Ranch, and his method with Cornelius was direct to the point of rudeness. He showed up at the ranch unannounced, twice, with figures and projections, and the polished argument that a man working a ranch alone was less efficient than a consolidated operation, that the land had more value in aggregate than in the single holding, that Cornelius would benefit substantially from a sale. Cornelius told him no both times with the precise, unequivocal courtesy of a man who has made his position clear and is running low on patience. The problem was what Greer did next, which was to begin circulating in town the suggestion that the Barnett Ranch's title had an irregularity from the original survey of '69, a suggestion that was just plausible enough to create uncertainty, and just vague enough to be difficult to definitively disprove without an expensive legal review. It was a pressure tactic, and it was not legal in any strict sense, but it operated in the gray territory of reputation and uncertainty where such men habitually worked. Virginia heard about it from Clara Finch on a Tuesday, and she sat with it for a day before she went to Cornelius and told him what she had heard directly, because he deserved to know, and because there was no version of their relationship in which she kept things from him to protect his feelings. He received the information with the stillness of a man who is very angry and has very good practice managing it. "I know about the suggestion," he said. I have already spoken to Alan Marsh about the title. Alan Marsh was the county assessor. He says the survey is sound. The issue is not the title, the issue is the story. What can I do? She said. He looked at her with an expression that was partly surprised and partly not surprised at all, because she was exactly the kind of woman who asked that question. Nothing yet, he said. I am going to San Antonio next week. The land office keeps copies of all surveys from that period. I will get a certified copy of the original and that will end the story. Good, she said. And in the meantime? In the meantime, I am going to go speak to Walter Greer myself, he said, with a quality to it that made Virginia feel no particular concern for Greer and considerable respect for Cornelius's restraint. The conversation between Cornelius Barnett and Walter Greer took place in the lobby of the Redemption Creek Hotel on Wednesday afternoon, and the specifics of it were not known because no one was close enough to hear. But the general quality of it was apparent from the fact that Greer checked out of the hotel on Friday and was not seen in Redemption Creek again. Whatever Cornelius had been said without raised voices. Several people noted that, and in a manner that had apparently left Greer with a very clear understanding of the parameters of the situation. Cornelius went to San Antonio as he had planned, returned with the certified survey copy, filed it with the county assessor for public record, and the story about the title irregularity died for lack of nourishment. It was not a dramatic resolution, but it was a thorough one, and it said a great deal about the character of the man that he had handled it methodically and without making it larger than it needed to be. He also came back from San Antonio with a small package that he gave Virginia without preamble on the Thursday after his return, a flat rectangular thing wrapped in brown paper. It was a book, a medical text, newly published on the treatment of fractures and dislocations, annotated by a surgeon in Philadelphia who was doing work that was ahead of most of the country. She had mentioned once, in passing, that she had read about it in a medical journal, but had not been able to obtain a copy. He had gone to 2 booksellers in San Antonio to find it. She held it and looked at him and felt something move very quietly through her chest. "Cornelius," she said. "It is not anything significant," he said, with the slight stiffness of a man who has done something tender and is watching to see if it was a mistake. "It is very significant," she said. "It is perfect." He exhaled once, a small sound of relief, and she loved him for it, for the vulnerability of it, for the way he cared whether she was pleased, for the fact that the scarred, self-contained man who had spent 9 years inside his own walls was standing in her office with his hat in his hands and the slight redness along the back of his neck that came from caring about what someone thought of him. She loved him. She had known it for a while. She thought he probably knew she knew it. But there is a difference between the private knowledge and the spoken thing. And it was March now, and there were redbuds blooming in the cedar brakes, and the South Creek was running high from the spring rains. And Virginia Bishop was 26 years old, and had never been less interested in proceeding cautiously in her life. She set the book on her desk and crossed the small space between them, and she kissed him, firmly and without ambiguity, right there in the back room of Pruett's office with the March light coming through the window. He was still for one shocked second, and then he was not still at all. He kissed her back with a completeness that had nothing cautious in it, and his hands were at her waist and her hands were at his face, both sides of it, the unmarked cheek and the scarred jaw, and she held it all with equal steadiness. And he made a sound against her lips that was very nearly a word, and entirely the most honest sound she had ever heard from a human being. They separated after a moment that was considerable, and he looked at her with an expression she had no previous reference point for, because no one had ever looked at her quite like that, with a fullness and a wonder and a certainty that were completely integrated, the expression of a man in whom something long closed had opened up so wide and so fast that the light was still flooding in. "Virginia," he said. "I know," she said. "I love you," he said, very plainly, as if the plain saying of it was the only thing that could do it justice. "I love you," she said back, in exactly the same tone. He put his forehead against hers, and they stood there in the March light while the redbud trees bloomed outside, and somewhere on the main street of Redemption Creek, a wagon went past with a great creaking of wheels, entirely unaware of the magnitude of what was happening in the back room of the doctor's office. Spring moved forward, and the world of Redemption Creek moved with it, and the story of Virginia Bishop and Cornelius Barnett moved through the town, the way important things move in small communities, quickly, and with a good deal of commentary. The commentary was mixed, because human communities are never entirely unified in their responses to happiness, and there were people who had opinions about the propriety of a nurse conducting a courtship with a rancher, and people who had opinions about Cornelius Barnett specifically, and people who had no real opinions, but felt that their absence would make the discussion less interesting. Mrs. Patton, who had been the most consistent voice of polite disapproval, reversed herself entirely in April after Virginia successfully managed a very difficult case involving Mrs. Patton's youngest son and a wood axe accident, and became instead one of the courtship's most vocal supporters, which surprised everyone including Virginia. Clara Finch was delighted and said so repeatedly. Harlan Pruitt noted that Virginia was arriving at work in a consistently excellent mood, and that this was improving the quality of patient care, which was his form of approval. Eddie Garza told the other ranch hands that Miss Bishop was going to be the best thing that ever happened to the Barnett Ranch, and the other ranch hands agreed, and Augusto, the cook, began planning a feast in anticipation of an event that had not yet been formally announced. In April, on a Saturday evening when the spring had warmed the air to something genuinely soft, and the South Creek was full and clear, and the live oaks were putting out their pale new leaves, Cornelius Barnett asked Virginia Bishop to marry him. He did it on the South Creek, because that was where things had begun to be true between them, and he did it without a prepared speech, because he was a man who trusted honest plain language over prepared speeches, and what he said was this: "I have spent 9 years building something on this land, and I was satisfied with it. And then you arrived, and I understood for the first time that the thing I was missing was someone to build it with. Someone to show it to and have it mean something to. I want that person to be you, not because I need you to be here, but because everything is more itself when you are in it. You make the land more like the land I want it to be. You make me more like the man I want to be." He stopped. "I do not have a ring yet. I wanted to ask before I presume to buy one." "Yes," Virginia said clearly and immediately, and then, "Go buy the ring." He did. It was a modest ring with a small garnet set in gold, because he had asked her once what her preferences were, and she had said something simple and real, and he had listened. She wore it on her left hand, and it caught the light in the back room of Pruitt's office, and on the ranch porch, and in every other place she inhabited, and she looked at it sometimes with the simple, uncomplicated satisfaction of a woman who has found exactly what she wanted in exactly the way she wanted to find it. They married in June, in the church that was newer than the saloons, on a morning when the air was already warm at 9 o'clock, and the redbud trees had given way to the summer flowering of the cedar sage and the rock roses. The church was full, because Redemption Creek understood that this was an event worth attending, and because Harlan Pruitt had invited everyone he knew, and because Clara Finch had taken a strong organizational interest in the flower arrangements. Eddie Garza and the ranch hands sat in the second pew on the right looking cleaned up and deeply moved, and Augusto was in the third pew with his wife and their 4 children, and the expression of a man whose long-standing prediction has been entirely vindicated. Virginia wore a dress that was the color of old ivory, simple and well-made, with her mother's tortoiseshell pins in her hair. She walked down the aisle of the small church without ceremony, without anyone to give her away, because she was a woman who came to things under her own power, and she looked at Cornelia standing at the front of the church with the steady, direct look she had been giving him since October, and he looked back at her with both eyes open and nothing guarded in his face. The minister read the words that were read at such occasions, and they said what they were asked to say with full meaning in every word. And when the minister got to the part about rings, Cornelius took her hand in both of his in the particular way he had that she loved completely, as if the holding were something he intended to do properly. And he put the wedding band on her finger with a precision and a gravity that made someone in the fourth pew cry quietly. He kissed her with the same lack of ambiguity that she had kissed him in the back room in March, and the church responded warmly, and Clara Finch threw flower petals because she had prepared them specifically for this purpose. Augusto's feast was everything he had planned it to be, held at the ranch in the afternoon, with tables set under the live oaks and music provided by the Lindstrom fiddle player and a man from town who played the guitar, and it lasted until the stars came out over the limestone hills. The years that followed were the kind of years that are made of very ordinary days stacked together so well that the stack becomes something extraordinary. Virginia continued her medical work. She and Harlan Pruitt built the practice together until it was the best-equipped medical office in that part of Texas. And when Harlan retired in 1882, Virginia Bishop Barnett was the one who continued it, the first woman in Redemption Creek history to run a medical practice, which caused approximately 2 weeks of community controversy, followed by a general acceptance based on the evidence of her competence. Cornelius expanded the ranch in the early 80s, adding a second water source in the north pasture and a breeding program for quarter horses that proved to be one of the best decisions he made. The horses developed a reputation across several counties, and the ranch's income diversified in a way that provided more security than any single commodity could. He made those decisions with Virginia at the table because she had a clear head for practical matters, and because he had long since stopped seeing value in doing things alone when he didn't have to. Their first child came in the spring of 1880, a boy they named Henry James Barnett, who arrived in the world with his father's dark eyes and his mother's quality of complete attention from approximately the first week of his life. Virginia delivered him with Harlan's assistance and Cornelius in the next room, which was as close as Virginia would allow him to pace, and she heard him through the wall for the 7 hours of it, and found it deeply endearing that this self-contained and steady man was working extremely hard not to come through the door. Henry was, from his earliest years, a child of the ranch, born to it the way both his parents had come to it by choice. He learned to ride at 3, as all ranch children did, with the patient instruction of his father and the firm safety policy of his mother, and he moved through the landscape of the ranch with the proprietary ease of someone who knew it as his own. They wrote to Cornelius's sister Clara in Kansas when Henry was born, and Clara wrote back with a joy that carried across the miles. And in 1881, Clara made the journey to Redemption Creek with her husband and her 3 children, and Virginia met the woman her husband had carried out of a burning house, and found her to be bright and warm and utterly without sentimentality about what had happened. Because Clara Barnett had spent years being grateful in a way that did not require the event to remain raw. The 2 women took to each other with the simple recognition of people who admire the same qualities in other people, and the visit was a week of genuine happiness that left Cornelius lighter in a way that Virginia had not seen before and was very glad to see now. Their second child was born in 1882, a girl they named Frances, after Virginia's mother. Frances arrived with considerably more drama than Henry had, a complicated presentation that Virginia had to manage herself with Cornelius's help, because Harlan was out at a farm and there was no time, and Cornelius followed her instructions with a focused calmness that she thought might be the most impressive thing she had ever watched a person do. Frances arrived safely, loudly, and with the evident intention of making herself known, which remained her primary characteristic. Henry was 2 when Frances was born, and regarded his sister with the measured assessment of a child who is not entirely sure this development is an improvement. He came around within a week. The ranch house acquired, over those years, the quality that comes when people live in a place deeply and attentively. Virginia planted the kitchen garden back seriously, with the practical focus of a woman who understood herbs and their uses. Cornelius built a porch addition on the south side that doubled the sitting space, because Virginia liked to read in the evening air, and he liked to sit beside her. There were books now throughout the house, accumulated in the way that books accumulate in households where reading is valued, stacked on shelves and on tables, and in the places where they had been set down and not quite returned. There were also, by the mid-'80s, changes in Redemption Creek that reflected the changes moving through the country. The railroad had reached a junction point 12 miles to the east, which transformed the economics of ranching in ways that were mostly good and occasionally difficult. New families arrived. Old ones departed. The town grew past 500, then towards 700. There was a second doctor, a young man named Ephraim Cole who came in 1884 and was good enough that Virginia felt comfortable sharing the work, and eventually, gradually, reducing her own hours as the children required more from her, though she never gave up the work entirely because she was not built to do so. Eddie Garza, who had been 20 when he broke his fibula and had been in some ways the reason Virginia and Cornelius met, became the Barnett Ranch foreman in 1883. He was good at it, level-headed and fair with the other hands, thoughtful about the cattle and the horses, loyal to the ranch without the kind of unthinking deference that makes a foreman useless when his judgment is needed. He married a woman named Lucia in 1884, a Tejana woman from a farming family south of town who was formidably competent, and who Virginia liked immediately and without reservation. Lucia and Eddie built a small house on the east edge of the ranch property, which Cornelius gave them the land for with the matter-of-fact generosity that was characteristic of him when he felt something was right. It was in the middle of this period, in 1885, that the thing happened which Virginia and Cornelius would later agree had been the most frightening week of their marriage. There had been a fever moving through the county since late summer, beginning in the lower farms along the river bottom and spreading along the patterns that fever follows, through families and neighbors and the small daily contacts of community life. Virginia had been tracking it since August with the systematic attention of someone who understands that a fever that is moving is more serious than a fever that is contained. She wrote letters to the State Health Board in Austin, reporting what she was seeing and asking for whatever information they had about similar outbreaks in other counties. She isolated the worst cases where she could convince families to do so, and she pressed hard on hygiene measures that most people found excessive, but that she was entirely certain were not. By September, the fever had reached the Barnett Ranch. Henry came down with it first, which meant Virginia was managing simultaneously as his mother and as his primary nurse, which is one of the hardest positions any medical professional faces. Cornelius watched her do it with an unwavering focus, watch her measure and administer, monitor the temperature, maintain the hydration, do the careful, unglamorous work of fever management with the same disciplined attention she brought to everything medical. And he later told her, more frightened in those 2 weeks than he had been since the night of the fire, and the fact of her steadiness was the thing that got him through it. Henry's fever broke on the 9th day, as high fevers in healthy children often do, with a sweat that soaked the sheets and left the boy limp and pale and finally, blessedly, sleeping peacefully. Virginia sat on the edge of his bed with her hand on his chest, feeling the regular healthy rise and fall of it, and the exhaustion of 9 days of close nursing hit her all at once, and Cornelius came into the room, took one look at her, and helped her up off the edge of the bed and through to their bedroom, and told her with the firm, gentle authority of a man who knows when someone needs to stop that she was going to sleep now. She did not argue, which told him everything about how tired she was. Frances, who was 3 and had her mother's constitution, did not get the fever. Lucia and Eddie's household was spared as well, following the precautions Virginia had established. The ranch hands had 2 cases, both mild, both recovered. On the scale of what the fever did to some families in the county, the Barnett Ranch came through remarkably well, and people in Redemption Creek understood that this was largely attributable to the woman who ran the medical practice on Main Street. After Henry recovered, Cornelius came home from a supply run to town and told Virginia that Mayor Aldrich, the husband of the woman who had turned away at the porch on that October afternoon, had told him that the town council was discussing a formal recognition of her work during the epidemic. Virginia's response to this was that she hoped they would instead spend the money on improving the drainage at the south end of Main Street, which had been contributing to the fever spread, and Cornelius laughed the real laugh she loved and said he would pass that on. They did improve the drainage, eventually. The years continued to move in their good, accumulating way. Henry grew into a boy who was interested in horses and mathematics in equal measure, which was a combination his father found entirely logical and his mother found pleasingly unexpected. He was 10 in 1890, serious and observant, and with a quality of stillness that he had inherited from Cornelius, combined with his mother's particular way of asking questions that arrived at the center of things. At school, he was a good student. On the ranch, he was his father's shadow. Frances was 8 and was the animal in perpetual motion that she had announced herself as being at birth. She had brown eyes and auburn hair, and her mother's directness applied to all situations without reservation, which made her simultaneously a delight and a challenge. She had decided at age 5 that she was going to be a doctor, and nothing subsequent had dislodged this conviction. Virginia encouraged it with the quiet satisfaction of a woman who understood that the best things you can give a daughter are the permission to know her own mind and the tools to make it real. In 1891, Virginia's 3rd pregnancy, she and Cornelius had a conversation while sitting on the south porch in the late summer evening that was one of those conversations that arrives without being planned and becomes, afterward, one of the conversations you remember. Henry was inside working on his sums. Frances had been put to bed an hour ago and had, by the sounds of it, gotten back up twice. The evening was heavy and gold, the kind of late summer evening in South Texas that smells of warm cedar and dry grass, and the hills to the south were soft in the last light. "Do you remember," Cornelius said, "what you said to me the first time I came to the office, about your father teaching you to look at what is actually there?" "I remember," she said. "I have been thinking about it lately," he said, "about what it would have been like the 9 years before you came, if I had been able to see it more clearly." He paused. "I do not regret the solitude entirely. The ranch required it. I was not ready for anything else. But I think I spent a great deal of time being unnecessarily certain about what I was suited for." "You had reasons," she said. "I had fears," he said, "which I had organized into reasons." A pause. "You showed me the difference." She turned to look at him in the gold evening light, the face she knew as well as she knew her own, both sides of it which were both entirely and completely his. "You showed it to yourself," she said. "I only refused to get out of the way." He looked at her for a long moment. "That is exactly what you did," he said, and there was a quality in his voice that she recognized as the particular happiness of being known accurately, not idealized, not reduced, but seen clearly and entirely. She reached across the space between their porch chairs and took his hand, and they sat together in the fading light while the evening came in over the hills, and Virginia Barnett felt the complete and specific satisfaction of a life that had been built deliberately and well, out of the things that were actually true. Their 3rd child arrived in early 1892, another boy, whom they named after Cornelius's father, Thomas William Barnett, and who arrived efficiently and without drama at a respectable hour of the morning, as if he had consulted everyone's schedule in advance. Thomas had his mother's auburn hair and his father's dark eyes, and a temperament that was, from the start, the most serene of the three children, a quality that led Francis to describe him, with the characteristic directness of a 9-year-old, as the pleasant one. Henry, who was 12 by then and had his own opinions about his station, said that he was also pleasant, and Francis said that he was serious, which was different, and Henry considered this and agreed, and the sibling taxonomy was established. Cornelius, watching his three children at the supper table on the first evening that Virginia was well enough to be up, with the lamp light falling on all of them, Francis gesturing emphatically about something, Henry making his case with methodical patience, the baby making the evaluative noises of a very new person, felt something that he had no adequate word for, which was something like gratitude but larger than gratitude. Something that encompassed all the years since the fire and the 9 years of the ranch alone, and the October afternoon, when a woman had stepped forward on a porch, while everyone else stepped back, and the South Creek in the winter light, and everything that had accumulated since, all of it arranged in such a way that the shape of it was visible, and the shape was good. He looked up from his children and found Virginia watching him from across the table with the steady brown eyes that had been looking at him clearly for 13 years, and she was smiling with the private, specific quality of a woman who is reading exactly what is in her husband's face and is herself deeply glad about all of it. "What?" she said, which was what she always said when she caught him looking. "Nothing," he said, which was what he always said and which meant everything. By 1893, the Barnett Ranch had 340 cattle, a quarter-horse breeding program with a growing regional reputation, a foreman's house on the east boundary occupied by Eddie and Lucia Garza and their 2 children, and a main house that had been added to twice and was beginning to have the solid, rooted quality of a place that has been loved and inhabited for a long time. The South Creek still ran clear over white limestone in all but the driest years, and the old live oaks along it had grown in the 15 years since Cornelius had first shown it to Virginia and become more themselves, wider in the trunk, more certain in the spread of their arms over the water. Virginia rode down there sometimes in the early morning when she had the time, with the oldest of the quarter horses, a good-natured gray that Henry had claimed as his own, but that Virginia regularly borrowed, and she sat beside the water in the clear light and thought about the things she needed to think about: her patients, her children, the decisions ahead. Cornelius had shown her this place as the most honest thing he had to offer, and she had received it in that spirit, and 15 years later it was still both, still the most honest place she knew. He found her there one morning in the fall of 1893, her 50th time or 100th time at the creek, and he dismounted and sat beside her on the flat limestone shelf with his boots in the edge of the shallow water the way he had stood the first time she came here, and they were quiet together in the good way they had learned to be quiet, the way that requires trust and gives rest. "Henry wants to study at the university in Austin," Cornelius said. "He told me last night." "I know," Virginia said. "He told me last week. He wanted to tell you himself, so I waited. He wants to study engineering. He told me mathematics, but he may have specified more in the week between." Cornelius considered the water. "I always thought he would take the ranch." "He will be back," Virginia said. "He loves this land the same way you do, but he is also more himself than the land, which is exactly what you would want him to be." A pause. "Yes," Cornelius said, "it is." He turned to look at her with the familiar expression, the one with the fullness in it. "How are you always right about things like that?" "I am not always right," she said. "I am right about the things that matter to me, and you and your children matter to me, so I pay attention. Francis has told Thomas that he is going to be the one who runs the ranch," he said. "She announced it over breakfast." Thomas seemed to accept it. Virginia laughed. Thomas would accept anything Francis told him as long as it was stated confidently enough. He is 6 months old and she has already organized him. "She is going to be extraordinary," he said. "She already is," Virginia said. "She is just 9. Give her time and she will do something that astonishes the whole county." He looked at her steadily. She learned that from her mother. Virginia met his eyes over the sound of the creek. "We did this together," she said. "We did," he said. He reached across and took her hand on the limestone shelf where she had first taken his, 15 years ago in the cold winter air. And they sat together while the fall sun moved over the live oaks and the water ran clear beneath them, and the day built itself quietly around them, as days do, as all the good ordinary days do, which accumulate into a life. The harvest social of 1893 was the 15th they had attended together since that first October evening, when Cornelius had crossed the cleared space toward her with a cup of cider, and a quality of cautious hope that she had found endearing then, and still found endearing in memory. Henry was at school in Austin. Francis and Thomas came with them. Francis in the dress she had pronounced acceptable after trying on 2 others. Thomas on his father's arm because he was a year and a half and still preferred carried to walking at social events. The Lindstrom fiddle player was still playing. He was 60 now, and his hair was entirely white, and he was still excellent. And the lanterns were strung again between the oak trees in the same pattern they had always been, and the late October air was warm the way it had been that first night, carrying the smell of cedar and distant grass. Clara Finch, who was now Clara Morrison and had 3 children of her own, found Virginia early in the evening and took her arm and said, "Do you know, I was the one who told you to go talk to him that first night," with the pleased possessiveness of someone claiming a credit that is both accurate and generous. "I know," Virginia said. "I should have thanked you years ago." "You thanked me at the wedding," Clara said comfortably. "I remember the exact words. But I accept all subsequent gratitude as well." Later in the evening, when the dancing was well underway and the lanterns had swung their way from formal to convivial, Cornelius appeared at Virginia's side with the same quiet inevitability he had developed in 15 years of being exactly where she was when she needed him to be there. And he offered his hand for the waltz that was just beginning, and she took it. He danced the way he did most things, with more capability than he showed, with a patience and a steadiness that were purely themselves. She danced with her hand in his and her shoulder under his arm and the October air soft around them, and she thought about the first night and the South Creek and the winter coffee and the March morning when she had kissed him without prelude, and the June wedding and Henry's fever and Thomas's early morning arrival and every morning at the South Creek. And all of it was present in the dancing, the whole accumulation of it, which was not weight, but ballast, the kind that keeps you steady, the kind you are glad to carry. "What are you thinking?" he asked, which was not what he usually asked, because he was generally better than most people at letting the thinking be private. "I am thinking about that first October," she said, "when you came over with the cider." "I was terrified," he said. "I know," she said. "I thought it was the most appealing thing I had ever seen a person do." He looked down at her with the full, warm, unguarded expression that had never gotten less remarkable in 15 years. "You never told me that," he said. "I am telling you now," she said. They danced through the end of the waltz and into the next tune, which was faster and less suited to conversation, and entirely suited to the simple pleasure of moving together in the October air under the lanterns. And around them the community of Redemption Creek danced and talked and ate, and lived the accumulated texture of a shared life in a shared place. And Virginia and Cornelius Barnett moved through it all the way they had moved through everything together, steadily, looking clearly at what was actually there, and finding it more than enough. The years continued, as years do, with their mix of ordinary days and extraordinary ones. Henry came home from Austin in 1896 with his engineering degree and a clearer sense than ever that the ranch was where he wanted to put his knowledge. And within 2 years, he had redesigned the water management system in a way that made the North pastures viable in drought years for the first time. He also came home with a quiet, intelligent young woman named Ada, whom he had met at the university, and who shook hands with Virginia on her first visit to the ranch with the frank, direct quality of someone who had been told a great deal about the family and wanted to make an accurate accounting. Virginia liked her immediately. Frances, as Virginia had predicted, did astonish the county and eventually more than the county. She went to study at the medical college in Galveston at 19. The year was 1901. Having demonstrated a preparation and a seriousness that made her admission, if not inevitable, at least achievable. And she went with her mother's medical texts in her trunk and her father's quality of steady attention, and a letter of recommendation from the now-retired Harlan Prout that was the most effusive letter he had ever written in his life. Thomas did take the ranch, as Frances had organized when he was 6 months old. He was, at 15, exactly the kind of young man who would be a good rancher, thoughtful, patient, deeply attentive to the land and the animals. He worked alongside his father and Eddie Garza with a seriousness of purpose that was the mark of someone who knows what he wants and what it will require of him. Virginia and Cornelius, in the first years of the new century, had reached the age at which people are sometimes described as settled, though neither of them was settled in the sense of being done. Virginia still saw patients, fewer than she had in her full practice years, but the ones she saw received the same focused attention she had always given. Cornelius still rode the ranch boundaries in the morning with the proprietary knowledge of a man who knows every piece of his land personally. They were both healthy, which was something Virginia attributed to clean water and good food, and the particular benefit of work that means something. The South Creek had a large flat rock on the east bank, deposited there by some flood years ago, that had become, over the decades, the specific rock where Virginia and Cornelius sat when they went to the creek together. It was wide enough for both of them and angled slightly toward the south so that it caught the afternoon sun, and in the fall and winter that warmth was something. They had been sitting on that rock at various intervals for over 20 years. They were sitting on it in the fall of 1903, Cornelius at 57 and Virginia at 51, on an afternoon when the live oaks were the deep dusty green of a dry year, and the water was lower than usual but still clear, still running, still catching the light in the particular way it had always caught it. There was a letter from Frances in Virginia's pocket, from Galveston, describing the work she was doing and the cases she was seeing with the vivid professional excitement of someone finding exactly the right life. There was a letter from Clara Barnett in Kansas, still writing twice a year as she always had, now about her grandchildren. Henry and Ada had their first child, a boy named Robert, and the baby's existence was the constant delighted subject of every conversation in the ranch house. Thomas was 19 and had taken on more of the ranch operations than he had been expected to for at least 2 more years, because he was ready, and because Eddie Garza was doing less as he got older, and had said so directly, in the way that Eddie had always had with Cornelius, the honest directness of a man who trusted his employer with the truth. "We have had a good life," Cornelius said, beside her on the rock, not as an accounting but as an observation, the way you might observe the weather or the quality of the creek's current, as a fact that deserved acknowledgement. "We are still having it," Virginia said. "Yes," he said, "that is the better way to say it." He looked at the water. "I think about what I was before you, the version of this ranch without you in it, and I cannot quite. It is like trying to picture the creek without the water. The shape is there, but it is not the thing." She leaned into his shoulder, the way she had been leaning into his shoulder for 25 years, the geography of it as familiar and specific as any landmark on the ranch. "When I stepped forward on that porch," she said, "I did it because I thought you deserved to be seen clearly. That is what I told Clara Morrison years later, and it is true. But if I am being entirely honest, I also stepped forward because I wanted to see you better. Because you interested me from that first moment on that horse in the rain, going about your life without apology or performance." She paused. "I did not know then what it would become, but I knew it was worth stepping toward." He turned to look at her, and the afternoon light was on both sides of his face equally, the face she had been looking at clearly for 25 years, which she knew as well as she knew anything in the world. "Virginia," he said, with the old quality in it, the door-opening quality that had never changed. "Yes," she said, with the old answer, which still meant everything. He put his arm around her on the warm, flat rock, and she put her head against his shoulder, and the South Creek ran clear over the limestone shelves, and the live oaks held their ancient ground, and the afternoon light spread across the hills where the ranch ran its 4,000 good acres of red dirt Texas country. And in the house up the hill, there was a grandchild and a son and a life that had been built deliberately out of honest materials by two people who had chosen to see clearly. This was not the ending of their story, because their story did not end that afternoon or many afternoons after it. It went on in the particular way that good lives go on, not in the dramatic arc of beginnings and revelations, but in the accumulated texture of ordinary days made extraordinary by the quality of attention brought to them. But if you asked Virginia Barnett, who had been Virginia Bishop on an October afternoon in 1878 when a scarred rancher rode past a porch, and she had stepped forward instead of back, if you asked her when she had understood the full shape of what she had found, she would have named this afternoon, this rock, this light on the creek. And Cornelius Barnett, who had spent 9 years believing he was suited for solitude and 15 more learning everything that proved him wrong, who had built a ranch out of nothing and a life out of the courage it had taken to step across the cleared space at a harvest social with a cup of cider and an honest heart, he would have named the same afternoon, the same rock, the same light, not because it was the most dramatic or the most significant, but because it was the moment in which they both, simultaneously and without discussion, understood that they had arrived, that the thing they had been building, day by careful honest day, was complete in its foundation, sound in its walls, and open to the sky. The creek ran on. The oak stood. The light held the color it always held in late October in that part of Texas, that particular quality that Virginia had described to Cornelius on the night of the harvest social, 25 years ago. The light that makes everything look like it is about to be remembered. Everything here was already remembered. Everything here was held.